The military compound as Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood rigidly at attention before the mahogany desk of Colonel Morrison. The office walls were adorned with commendations, battle flags, and photographs of distinguished officers who had served with honor. All men, she noted with a familiar pang of frustration. Her request form lay crisp and white on the colonel's desk, the ink still fresh from her careful penmanship. Requisition for precision rifle assignment. Combat Operation Blackwood. A rifle? Colonel Morrison's voice dripped with barely concealed amusement as he leaned back in his leather chair, the springs creaking under his weight. His weathered face, marked by years of desert campaigns and bureaucratic battles, twisted into what might have been a smile if it weren't so condescending. Lieutenant Chen, with all due respect, you're a communications specialist. Your expertise lies in radios and encryption, not marksmanship. The snickers that rippled through the room from the assembled officers felt like physical blows. Major Phillips, a man whose gut strained against his uniform buttons, shook his head with theatrical disapproval. "Sarah, darling," he said, using the patronizing tone that made her jaw clench, "leave the heavy lifting to the men. You're far too valuable behind a desk to risk in the field." Captain Rodriguez, younger but no less dismissive, chimed in with a laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. "Besides, those rifles are heavy. 50 caliber Barrett M82s aren't exactly designed for—" He gestured vaguely in her direction. "Someone of your stature." Sarah's hands remained clasped behind her back, her knuckles white with the effort of maintaining military bearing while her blood boiled beneath the surface. At 5'4" and weighing barely 120 pounds, she had heard every variation of this argument throughout her 8-year military career. Too small, too delicate, too female. The irony wasn't lost on her that these same men had praised her attention to detail and steady hands when she was decoding enemy transmissions or maintaining complex communication arrays. "Sir," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor of anger threatening to break through. "I've completed advanced marksmanship training at Fort Benning. My scores—" "Paper targets," interrupted Colonel Morrison with a wave of his hand, as if swatting away an annoying fly. "Combat is different, Lieutenant. The enemy shoots back. They don't stand still at predetermined distances with convenient bullseyes painted on their chests." The room erupted in another round of masculine laughter, the sound bouncing off the walls like artillery fire. Sarah felt heat creeping up her neck, but she forced herself to remain perfectly still. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from her childhood in rural Montana. "When they underestimate you, Sarah Bear, that's when you have your greatest advantage." Furthermore, the colonel continued, clearly enjoying his audience, "Operation Blackwood requires our best snipers. We're talking about eliminating high-value targets at extreme range under adverse conditions. The margin for error is 0. We can't afford to send someone on a—" He paused, savoring the words. A diversity experiment." The casual cruelty of the phrase hit her like a slap. Diversity experiment. As if her years of service, her decorated record, her technical expertise that had saved countless lives, as if all of it was reduced to nothing more than political correctness run amok. "Major." Phillips leaned forward in his chair, his expression mock serious. "Tell you what, Chen, why don't you stick to what you do best? We'll need someone to coordinate communications during the operation. Very important work. Very safe work. Essential work," Captain Rodriguez added with exaggerated solemnity. Though, his eyes danced with mirth. "Behind several layers of concrete and steel, where you belong." Sarah's vision blurred momentarily, not from tears. She had learned long ago never to give them that satisfaction, but from the sheer force of her suppressed rage. 8 years. 8 years of proving herself over and over again, only to be dismissed because of assumptions about her gender and size. 8 years of being the best communications officer in 3 different units, of volunteering for dangerous assignments, of earning respect through competence and dedication, only to watch it evaporate the moment she stepped outside their narrow expectations of what she should be doing. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she stood there, the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to break, to storm out in a huff of feminine emotion, to prove their point about women being too emotional for combat roles. Instead, she straightened her spine another impossible degree and fixed her gaze on a point just above Colonel Morrison's head. "Sir, I respectfully maintain my request for rifle assignment to Operation Blackwood." This time, the laughter was louder, more derisive. Someone, she thought it might have been Major Phillips, actually slapped his knee. "Persistent little thing, isn't she?" he wheezed between chuckles. Colonel Morrison's expression hardened, the amusement fading from his features like smoke in the wind. "Lieutenant Chen, your request is denied. Report to Communications Command at 600 tomorrow for operation briefing. You're dismissed." The finality in his voice was unmistakable. Sarah snapped a perfect salute, her movements crisp and professional despite the inferno raging in her chest. "Yes, sir." She had turned to leave, her boots clicking against the polished floor in perfect rhythm, when the office door swung open with enough force to rattle the framed photographs on the walls. The conversation died instantly, as if someone had thrown a switch. General Marcus Thorne stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room like gathering storm clouds. Even without his stars and ribbons, he would have commanded attention. A man carved from granite and tempered by decades of warfare. His steel-gray hair was cropped close to his skull, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of cold intensity that had stared down enemy fire in 3 different theaters of war. "As you were," he said quietly, but every man in the room snapped to attention anyway. His voice carried the kind of authority that came not from rank alone, but from the absolute certainty that he had earned every ounce of respect he commanded. His gaze swept the room slowly, taking in the assembled officers with the calculating precision of a predator assessing potential threats. When his eyes finally settled on Sarah, something flickered across his features. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, and his voice carried a weight that made the previous mockery seem like children's games. "I understand. You've requested rifle assignment for Operation Blackwood." The room held its collective breath. Colonel Morrison's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Sir, we were just explaining to the lieutenant that her skills are better utilized in communications." General Thorne's hand rose slightly, a gesture so minimal it was barely perceptible, but Colonel Morrison's words died in his throat as if severed by a blade. The silence that followed was profound, pregnant with unspoken tension. The general's eyes never left Sarah's face as he spoke, his words measured and deliberate. "Tell me, Lieutenant, what makes you think you're qualified? For precision shooting?" Sarah felt the shift in the room's atmosphere like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. This wasn't mockery or dismissal. This was an examination. Her pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, I graduated top of my class in advanced marksmanship at Fort Benning. I've maintained expert qualification scores for 6 consecutive years. I have steady hands from technical work and experience in high-pressure situations." General Thorne nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he already knew. "And your longest confirmed shot, Lieutenant?" The question caught her, off guard. It was specific, technical, the kind of detail that suggested more than casual interest. 800 meters, sir, during training exercises in Nevada." "Confirmed by whom?" "Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, sir. Range instructor." A ghost of a smile played at the corners of the general's mouth. "Ah, yes, Martinez. Good man. Doesn't suffer. Fools or exaggerate achievements." He paused, his gaze shifting to encompass the other officers in the room. "Gentlemen, I wonder if any of you could match Lieutenant Chen's longest shot." The silence that followed was deafening. Major Phillips shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. Captain Rodriguez suddenly found the floor fascinating. Colonel Morrison's jaw worked soundlessly, as if he were chewing words he couldn't quite bring himself to speak. General Thorne's attention returned to Sarah, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an undercurrent that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Tell me, Lieutenant, have you ever heard of the Black Talon mark?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, exactly, but recognition that she had just crossed into territory far beyond her understanding. "No, sir, I haven't." The general's pale eyes seemed to look right through her, as if he were seeing something she couldn't comprehend. Around the room, she noticed subtle changes in the other officers' postures. Colonel Morrison had gone completely still, his face blank but his eyes wide. Major Phillips had stopped fidgeting entirely. Captain Rodriguez looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Few have," General Thorne said quietly, and his voice carried echoes of distant battlefields and classified operations. "It's not something we advertise in recruitment brochures or discuss in tactical manuals." He moved further into the room, his boots silent on the floor despite his imposing frame. The other officers pressed themselves back against the walls as if his mere presence required additional space. Sarah remained at attention, but every instinct screamed that she was standing at the epicenter of something far larger than a simple equipment requisition. "The Black Talon mark," the general continued, his voice taking on an almost ceremonial quality, "is given to operators who demonstrate not just exceptional marksmanship, but the psychological profile necessary for specialized operations. Operations that exist in the spaces between what the military acknowledges and what national security requires." Sarah's mouth went dry. She had heard whispers, fragments of conversations that stopped when junior officers entered the room, rumors about units that didn't officially exist and missions that never appeared in after-action reports. But she had never imagined, never dared to hope, that such things might be within her reach. General Thorne stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the small scar that ran along his jawline, a souvenir from some long ago conflict. "The question, Lieutenant Chen, is not whether you can handle a rifle. The question is whether you can handle what comes after you pull the trigger." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah understood, with crystalline clarity, that her casual request for field assignment had somehow opened a door she hadn't even known existed. The mocking laughter of moments before seemed like it had happened in another lifetime, in another world where the stakes were measured in hurt feelings rather than whatever this was. "I believe I can, sir," she heard herself say, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. General Thorne studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes seeming to weigh and measure her very soul. Finally, he nodded, a barely perceptible movement that somehow carried the weight of a military tribunal's verdict. "Colonel Morrison," he said without turning around, "Lieutenant Chen's request is approved. She'll report to Building 7 at 0400 tomorrow for specialized briefing." He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "Anyone who has a problem with this decision is welcome to discuss it with me personally." The threat was delivered so quietly, so politely, that it took a moment for its full implications to register. When they did, Sarah watched Colonel Morrison's face cycle through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly gray. "Yes, sir," the colonel managed, his voice barely above a whisper. General Thorne turned back to Sarah, and for just a moment she glimpsed something in his expression that might have been approval, or perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit. "Tomorrow, Lieutenant, you begin to learn what it really means to serve your country. I suggest you get some rest. You're going to need it." As he moved toward the door, Sarah found her voice one final time. "Sir, what exactly is the Black Talon mark?" The general paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the bright hallway beyond. When he spoke, his words seemed to come, from a great distance, carrying with them the weight of secrets and the promise of transformation. It's what happens when someone stops seeing targets and starts seeing solutions to problems that keep generals awake at night. He glanced back at her one last time, and his smile was sharp as a blade. "Welcome to the real war, Lieutenant Chen." The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Sarah alone with 5 officers who suddenly seemed very small and very quiet in their expensive chairs. The silence stretched until Colonel Morrison cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well," he said, his voice lacking any of its earlier authority, "I suppose you have preparations to make, Lieutenant." Sarah nodded crisply, her mind already racing ahead to tomorrow morning, to Building 7, to whatever lay beyond the comfortable boundaries of conventional military service. As she left the office, she could feel their eyes on her back. No longer mocking, but watchful, perhaps even fearful. The hallway seemed different as she walked toward her quarters, as if the very air had changed composition. Other soldiers she passed looked at her strangely, and she wondered if something in her bearing had shifted, if the weight of unspoken secrets was already beginning to show. That evening, as she sat on her narrow bunk cleaning her service pistol, with methodical precision, Sarah reflected on how a simple equipment request had somehow become a gateway to a world she hadn't known existed. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions she hadn't known to ask. Tomorrow would begin her real education in the art of war, but tonight, for the last time, she was simply Lieutenant Sarah Chen, communications specialist, small-town girl from Montana who had joined the military to serve her country and prove herself in a man's world. By tomorrow night, she suspected that person might no longer exist. Building 7 didn't exist on any official base map, and Sarah understood why the moment she approached its nondescript gray exterior at 0355 hours, nestled between the motor pool and a storage facility for obsolete equipment, it looked like nothing more than another forgotten military warehouse, exactly as it was meant to appear. The only indication of its true nature was the subtle hum of sophisticated electronics and the fact that, despite the early hour, warm light spilled from windows that had been painted black from the inside. Her approach was monitored. She could feel eyes tracking her movement across the empty courtyard, though she couldn't identify the watchers. When she reached the unmarked steel door, it opened before she could knock, revealing a woman in her 30s with prematurely silver hair and eyes the color of winter storms. "Lieutenant Chen," the woman said, extending a calloused hand. "I'm Captain Diana Wolf. Welcome to the place that doesn't exist." The interior of Building 7 defied every expectation Sarah had formed during her sleepless night of speculation. What appeared from outside to be a simple warehouse was actually a sophisticated facility that seemed to burrow deep into the earth itself. The main floor buzzed with activity. Analysts bent over computer screens displaying satellite imagery, technicians calibrating equipment she couldn't identify, and in the center of it all, a 3-dimensional holographic display showing what appeared to be a detailed map of Eastern European terrain. "Impressive, isn't it?" Captain Wolf said, noting Sarah's wide-eyed expression. "Most people expect secret military installations to be sterile and intimidating, but we've found that creativity flourishes in environments that feel less like prisons and more like workshops." As they walked deeper into the facility, Sarah noticed details that spoke to the unit's unconventional nature. The walls displayed not just military commendations, but patents for technological innovations, published research papers, and photographs that showed soldiers working alongside civilians in settings that looked more like university laboratories than military bases. "Captain Wolf," Sarah began, then hesitated. "What exactly is this place?" Wolf's smile was enigmatic. "It's where we solve problems that don't have conventional solutions, where we ask, what if, instead of, that's not how we do things. Where someone like you, brilliant, overlooked, frustrated by institutional limitations, can finally operate at their full potential." They descended a staircase Sarah hadn't noticed from the main floor, entering a corridor lined with doors bearing cryptic designations: Psychological Warfare Research, Advanced Ballistics Laboratory, Scenario Planning Alpha. The deeper they went, the more Sarah felt like Alice falling down a rabbit hole into a wonderland of military secrets. The Black Talon program, Wolf continued as they walked, was established 15 years ago by General Thorne when he was still a colonel. He had a theory that the military was hemorrhaging talent by forcing square pegs into round holes. Brilliant individuals who didn't fit traditional molds were being wasted in conventional roles when they could be solving problems that kept national security advisors awake at night. They stopped before a door marked simply Range Complex, and Wolf's expression grew more serious. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah? What I'm about to show you is classified at levels that most generals never reach. Your life is about to change in ways you cannot imagine. Last chance to walk away and return to your comfortable, predictable world of radio communications." Sarah met Wolf's storm-gray eyes without flinching. "I didn't come this far to turn back now, ma'am." Wolf's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." The door opened to reveal not a shooting range, but something far more extraordinary. The space stretched out before them like an underground canyon, its ceiling lost in shadows 40 feet above. But what took Sarah's breath away wasn't the size, it was the complexity. This wasn't a simple firing range with targets at fixed distances. This was a three-dimensional puzzle of platforms, obstacles, and moving targets that created an environment more like a deadly video game than traditional marksmanship training. "Welcome to the Crucible," Wolf said, her voice carrying a note of pride, "where we separate the marksman from the artists." Suspended throughout the space were targets of every conceivable type, some static, some moving in complex patterns, some that appeared and disappeared according to algorithms Sarah couldn't begin to decipher. Multiple levels of catwalks and platforms created shooting positions at various heights and angles, connected by narrow bridges that would test balance and nerve as much as marksmanship skill. "Traditional sniper training teaches you to eliminate targets," Wolf explained as they walked along the main catwalk. "Black Talon training teaches you to eliminate problems. Sometimes that's a person. Sometimes it's a piece of equipment. Sometimes it's a situation that requires thinking so far outside conventional parameters that normal operators can't even see the solution." They stopped at a weapons rack that made Sarah's heart race. These weren't standard military rifles. They were masterpieces of engineering that married cutting-edge technology with artisanal craftsmanship. Weapons that looked like they belonged in the hands of characters from science fiction movies rather than real-world soldiers. "The XM-2010 Enhanced Sniper Rifle," Wolf said, lifting a weapon that seemed to shimmer with an almost organic beauty. "Effective range of 1-200 meters in standard configuration, but we've made some modifications." The rifle felt different in Sarah's hands, not just the weight, though it was surprisingly light, but the balance, the way it seemed to mold itself to her grip as if it had been custom-built for her specifically. The scope was unlike anything she'd ever seen, displaying not just magnified imagery, but overlays of data that shifted and adjusted in real time. Atmospheric conditions, wind speed and direction, target movement prediction, even stress indicators in your own biometrics, Wolf explained, watching Sarah explore the weapon's features. "But the technology is only as good as the operator, and that's where things get interesting." She led Sarah to a platform overlooking the complex training environment. Below them, targets moved in patterns that seemed random but felt somehow purposeful, like dancers performing a choreography only they understood. "Your first test," Wolf said, handing Sarah a single round of ammunition. A bullet unlike any she'd ever seen, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to catch and reflect light in impossible ways. "There's a target down there. That's been specifically configured for your psychological profile. Find it, eliminate it. But remember, this isn't about marksmanship. This is about seeing solutions where others see only problems." Sarah studied the maze below, her mind racing to identify patterns, to understand the logic behind the seemingly chaotic movement of targets. Minutes passed in silence as she analyzed trajectories, predicted behaviors, searched for the solution that Wolf insisted existed. Then she saw it. Not a target in the conventional sense, but a sequence. A pattern of movements that created a brief window of opportunity. A moment when 3 separate moving elements would align to create a shot that was theoretically impossible, but practically inevitable for someone who could see the choreography hidden within the chaos. She settled into firing position, her breathing slowing as she entered the meditative state that had always accompanied her best shooting. The modified rifle felt like an extension of her own nervous system, its advanced systems providing information while somehow staying out of her way, augmenting rather than replacing her natural instincts. The shot, when it came, surprised even her with its inevitability. The bullet traced a path through 3 separate moving obstacles, ricocheted off a precisely angled metal surface, and struck a target that hadn't even been visible when she'd pulled the trigger. A target that only became exposed for a fraction of a second when the ricocheting bullet triggered a mechanism that revealed it. The silence that followed was different from the mockery she'd endured in Colonel Morrison's office. This was the silence of reverence, of witnessing something that bordered on impossible. 19 minutes, Wolf said, consulting a stopwatch Sarah hadn't noticed her holding. The previous record was 47 minutes, set by a Special Forces operator with 12 years of combat experience. Sarah lowered the rifle, her hands trembling slightly with adrenaline and the magnitude of what had just occurred. "I don't understand. How did I know?" "You didn't know," Wolf interrupted, her voice carrying a strange mixture of excitement and something that might have been fear. "You intuited. You saw patterns that existed below the threshold of conscious recognition. You solved a problem that required thinking in dimensions most people can't even perceive." She gestured toward the target Sarah had hit, a small disc barely visible in the shadows 40 feet below. That target was designed by artificial intelligence to be unsolvable by conventional thinking. It required someone to abandon linear logic and embrace what we call lateral ballistics, using physics and geometry in ways that seem impossible until someone proves they're not. The implications of Wolf's words crashed over Sarah like a cold wave. She wasn't just being recruited for sniper duties. She was being evaluated for something that existed beyond normal military operations, in a space where the impossible became merely difficult, and the difficult became routine. "Who else has the black Talon mark?" Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer would be unsettling. Wolf's expression grew distant, as if she were looking at ghosts only she could see. "There are 12 of us active worldwide. We don't know each other's identities. Operational security requires complete compartmentalization. We communicate through General Thorne or intermediaries like myself. We work alone, think alone, kill alone." The word kill hung in the air between them like a sword blade. Sarah had always known intellectually that military service might require taking human life, but this felt different, more personal, more deliberate, more artistic. "And if I accept?" Sarah asked, though she realized with startling clarity that she had already made her choice the moment she'd fired that impossible shot. "Then Lieutenant Sarah Chen ceases to exist. At least officially. You'll be transferred to a unit that doesn't appear on organizational charts, working on operations that never happened to eliminate threats that were never acknowledged to exist. Your family will receive carefully crafted letters about your reassignment to classified communications research. Your friends will gradually lose touch as your official duties take you to places that don't exist on maps." Wolf paused, letting the weight of the sacrifice settle over Sarah like a funeral shroud. "But you'll also become part of something magnificent. You'll solve puzzles that save thousands of lives. You'll prevent wars that would have cost millions. You'll become a guardian angel that works in shadows, protecting people who will never know your name or understand your sacrifice." Sarah looked down at the rifle in her hands, its alien technology and impossible precision a perfect metaphor for the choice before her. She could return to her safe, predictable world of radio communications, where her greatest challenge would be coordinating supply drops and her biggest victory would be a particularly clear transmission. Or she could step into the unknown, into a realm where her unique talents could finally find their proper expression. "There's something else," Wolf added quietly. "Something General Thorne didn't mention upstairs. The Black Talon program. It changes you. Not just your skills or your clearance level, it changes how you see the world, how you process information, how you relate to other people. Some call it evolution, others call it a form of controlled madness." The honesty in Wolf's voice was both terrifying and oddly comforting. At least she wasn't being recruited with lies or false promises. Whatever lay ahead, she was being given the truth, or as much of it as security permitted. "Why me?" Sarah asked. "There must be others with better scores, more experience, stronger recommendations." Wolf's laugh was soft but carried no humor. "Because, Sarah, you did something in that office upstairs that none of those others could do. You maintained perfect military bearing while being systematically humiliated. You held on to your dignity and your purpose while lesser people tried to crush your spirit. That kind of psychological resilience, combined with your technical abilities—" She shrugged. "It's exactly what we need." Sarah realized then that her entire military career, every slight, every dismissal, every time she'd been underestimated and overlooked, had been preparation for this moment. The very experiences that had frustrated and angered her had also forged her into exactly the kind of person this shadowy program needed. "When do I start?" she asked, and was surprised to hear how calm her voice sounded. Wolf's smile was genuinely warm for the first time since they'd met. "You already have. The moment you walked into that office yesterday and refused to back down, you began the process of becoming someone new. Tomorrow, we simply make it official." As they walked back through the facility, Sarah noticed things she'd missed on the way in, subtle details that spoke to the program's true nature, photographs of urban environments with certain buildings circled in red, maps with routes marked in colors that corresponded to no conventional military coding. System. Computer screens displaying data streams that seemed to track individuals rather than troop movements. "One last question," Sarah said as they reached the main floor. "The name, Black Talon. What does it mean?" Wolf paused at the exit, her hand on the door handle. "Have you ever watched a hawk hunt, Sarah? Not just killing for food, but the way it moves through the sky, the way it sees the world below, the way it can spot a mouse in tall grass from 1,000 feet up." Sarah nodded, remembering childhood days in the Montana wilderness where she'd spent hours watching raptors circle overhead. "A black talon is what marks the prey," Wolf said softly. "One precise strike, usually invisible until it's too late. The hawk doesn't announce its presence, doesn't threaten or posture. It simply appears, solves the problem, and disappears back into the sky." As Sarah walked back to her quarters through the pre-dawn darkness, she carried with her the weight of transformation. Tomorrow she would return to Building 7 not as Lieutenant Chen requesting field assignment, but as something else entirely. A guardian angel with a sniper's eye and a hawk's patience, ready to solve problems that existed in the spaces between, what was acknowledged and what was necessary. The other soldiers she passed in the corridors looked smaller somehow, as if she were already beginning to see the world from a great height, with the piercing clarity of a predator who had finally found her proper hunting ground. 3 weeks later, Sarah discovered that everything she thought she knew about warfare was a children's game compared to the reality of Black Talon operations. The woman who had once been Lieutenant Chen now existed in a liminal space between identities, officially reassigned to Communications Research Division, but actually undergoing the most intensive and disturbing training program she could have imagined. The morning briefing took place in a room that looked like mission control for a space program. if space programs were designed by paranoid geniuses with unlimited budgets. Screens covered every surface, displaying real-time intelligence feeds from around the globe. The air hummed with the constant whisper of encrypted communications, and Sarah had learned not to ask about the sources of information that seemed to flow from places that officially didn't cooperate with American intelligence. Today's scenario. Captain Wolf announced to the assembled group of 6 trainees, though Sarah had begun to suspect that trainee was an inadequate term for what they were becoming, involves a target in Prague who has been selling NATO communication protocols to hostile actors. The central holographic display flickered to life, showing a 3-dimensional model of a European city with photographic detail. Sarah could see individual windows, street-level traffic patterns, even pedestrians moving along sidewalks in real time. Simulation. Conventional approach would be extraction or elimination via a special forces team. Wolf continued, manipulating the display to highlight various locations throughout the city. Unfortunately, our target is a paranoid individual who never follows the same route twice, never meets contacts in the same location, and maintains security protocols that make traditional approaches problematic. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the program's psychological operations specialist, stepped forward. A small woman with dark eyes that seemed to catalog and analyze every micro-expression, she had joined Black Talon after developing interrogation techniques that were simultaneously more effective and more humane than anything in the conventional military arsenal. Intelligence indicates that our target has developed an obsession with vintage motorcycles, Dr. Vasquez said, her accent carrying traces of her childhood in Barcelona. Specifically, a 1973 BMW R75-5 that will be auctioned next Tuesday at a ITA location here. A red dot appeared on the holographic city. Sniper nest? Asked Marcus Cole, a former Navy SEAL whose transition to Black Talon had been motivated by frustration with what he called the blunt instrument approach to special operations. His question was directed at Sarah, and she realized with a chill that she was expected to provide the solution. Sarah studied the display, her mind automatically calculating angles, distances, environmental factors. But something nagged at her, a sense that the obvious answer was wrong, that the problem required the kind of lateral thinking Wolf had mentioned during her recruitment. No, she said slowly, her certainty growing as she spoke. A sniper shot would work, but it would also expose our involvement. NATO protocols in hostile hands suggests our target has buyers who would immediately suspect American involvement if he suddenly dies of a bullet wound. Wolf nodded approvingly. Continue. The motorcycle auction, Sarah said, pieces clicking into place in her mind like components of a complex machine. He's obsessed, which means he'll be emotionally invested, not thinking clearly about security. But, more importantly, vintage motorcycles are temperamental. They have mechanical quirks, especially electrical systems from the 1970s. Dr. Vasquez's eyes lit up with understanding. You're thinking sabotage disguised as mechanical failure. Better than that, Sarah said, her confidence building as the solution crystallized. I'm thinking about creating a situation where our target eliminates himself while we maintain complete deniability. She manipulated the holographic display, zooming in on the auction location. The BMW will need to be test-started before bidding begins. Vintage motorcycle collectors always insist on hearing the engine. If someone were to modify the electrical system to create a small explosion after a specific sequence of operations, say, electric start, first gear engagement, throttle application, it would look exactly like the kind of catastrophic mechanical failure these old bikes are famous for. Marcus whistled low. Damn, that's elegantly vicious, but it requires someone with both technical expertise and access to the motorcycle before the auction, Wolf pointed out, though her tone suggested approval rather than criticism. Sarah's smile was sharp. Communications specialists know electrical systems and someone small enough to look like just another motorcycle enthusiast instead of a military operator could gain access during the pre-auction inspection period. The room fell silent as the implications of her proposal settled over the group. This wasn't just creative problem-solving, it was thinking several dimensions beyond conventional military tactics. It was the kind of solution that left no traces, no witnesses, no evidence of foreign involvement. "There's a problem," Dr. Vasquez said quietly. "Our psychological profile indicates the target won't bid on any motorcycle unless he can personally inspect the engine first. Thoroughly, he's paranoid about mechanical authenticity." Sarah felt the familiar rush of a puzzle clicking into place. "Then we don't sabotage the bike he's buying. We sabotage the entire electrical system of the auction house. Create a power surge that affects all the vintage motorcycles simultaneously. He dies in what appears to be a freak electrical accident that kills multiple people. Tragic, but clearly accidental." The silence that followed was different from the respectful quiet after her impossible shot in the crucible. This was the silence of people recognizing that they were in the presence of something unprecedented. A mind that could construct solutions to problems that existed in moral and practical gray areas most people couldn't even navigate. Wolf exchanged a look with Dr. Vasquez that Sarah couldn't interpret. "Sarah," Wolf said carefully, "what you just described would result in multiple civilian casualties." 4, based on the auction house layout and typical attendance patterns, Sarah replied. Immediately, then paused as she realized what she'd just said. I calculated that automatically." The room's atmosphere shifted subtly, like air pressure changing before a storm. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's climate control system. Something was happening to her mind, something that went beyond enhanced tactical thinking. "It's starting," Dr. Vasquez murmured, her voice carrying notes of both fascination and concern. "The psychological adaptation we warned you about." "What's starting?" Sarah asked, though part of her already understood that she wouldn't like the answer. Wolf's expression was unreadable. "Black Talon operators develop what we call consequentialist clarity. You begin to see human lives as variables in equations rather than individuals with inherent value. It's necessary for the work we do, but it comes with costs." Sarah felt something cold spreading through her chest. Not fear, exactly, but recognition that she was changing in ways that might not be reversible. The woman who had joined the military to serve and protect was becoming something else. Something that could calculate acceptable casualties with the same emotional detachment she'd once reserved for equipment maintenance schedules. "The good news," Wolf continued, "is that Dr. Vasquez has developed techniques to help you maintain your humanity while accessing these enhanced analytical capabilities. Think of it as compartmentalization with safeguards." "And the bad news?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Dr. Vasquez stepped forward, her dark eyes compassionate but unflinching. "The bad news is that once you've seen the world this way, you can never completely unsee it. You'll always know that behind every political crisis, every terrorist attack, every international incident, there are people like us working in shadows to prevent worse outcomes. You'll know that peace is maintained by individuals willing to make choices that would horrify normal people." Sarah looked around the room at her fellow trainees. Marcus with his 1,000-yard stare that spoke of too many impossible decisions. Dr. Vasquez with her clinical detachment that masked whatever empathy she'd sacrificed for the greater good. Wolf with her silver hair that seemed premature for someone her age. "Is it worth it?" Sarah asked quietly. Wolf's smile was sad and proud. Simultaneously, "Ask me again in 6 months when you've prevented your first war, when you've saved 10,000 lives by taking one, when you've solved a problem that would have kept General Thorne awake for the rest of his career." She gestured toward the Prague scenario still displayed on the holographic projector. "But first, we need to refine your approach. 4 civilian casualties is acceptable for this particular threat level, but we should explore whether the problem can be solved with fewer, Variables. As Sarah turned back to the display, she felt the last vestiges of her old self slipping away like water through her fingers. Lieutenant Chen had been a good soldier, a competent communications specialist, a woman trying to prove herself in a male-dominated world. But that woman would never have been capable of what was being asked of her now. That woman would have hesitated, second-guessed herself, been paralyzed by moral complexities that now seemed like luxuries she could no longer afford. The person she was becoming understood that sometimes protecting innocence required sacrificing it, that sometimes serving your country meant becoming something your country could never officially acknowledge, that sometimes the greatest act of love was accepting that those you protected would never understand the price of their safety. Dr. Vasquez, Sarah said, her voice steady as surgical steel. I want to discuss those psychological safeguards you mentioned. I need to understand how to access this analytical state without losing myself completely. Dr. Vasquez nodded approvingly. Excellent. Self-awareness is the first defense against complete psychological integration. You're ahead of schedule in recognizing the need for emotional firewalls. As the briefing continued, Sarah found herself studying her colleagues with new eyes, not as fellow soldiers but as case studies in successful psychological adaptation to impossible moral terrain. Each of them had found ways to maintain essential humanity while operating beyond conventional ethical boundaries. She was beginning to understand that the Black Talon mark wasn't just about marksmanship or tactical innovation. It was about becoming someone who could carry the weight of necessary evils without being crushed by them, someone who could make impossible choices and sleep soundly afterward, someone who could love their country enough to become something their country could never officially love back. The training that followed would test not just her shooting skills, but her capacity to remain human while becoming something more and something less than the woman who had walked into Colonel Morrison's office just 3 weeks ago. 6 months after receiving her Black Talon mark, a small, nearly invisible scar behind her left ear where a microscopic tracking device had been implanted, Sarah stood on a rooftop in Sarajevo, watching her target through a scope that cost more than most people's houses. The rain fell in sheets around her, turning the ancient city into a watercolor painting of gray and amber lights, but her modified rifle's environmental compensation systems rendered the weather irrelevant. Below, in a cafe that had somehow survived 3 wars and countless political upheavals, a man named Viktor Kozlov was about to conclude a transaction that would destabilize the entire Balkan region. He didn't look like a monster. Few of them ever did. Mid-50s, graying hair, the soft build of someone who fought his wars with bank transfers and encrypted communications rather than bullets and bombs. To any casual observer, he appeared to be simply another businessman enjoying coffee with associates on a rainy evening. Sarah knew better. The intelligence packet burned into her memory contained details that would have kept her awake for weeks before her transformation. Weapons shipments to ethnic extremist groups, funding for terrorists, cells that targeted civilian populations, coordination of attacks that would spark retaliatory violence across 3 countries. Viktor Kozlov was a chaos merchant, and his current meeting was arranging the sale of chemical weapons to groups that would use them against refugee camps. Target acquired, she whispered into her throat mic, her words carried by encrypted satellite. Relay to a control room that didn't exist in any official capacity. Clean shot available. Environmental factors compensated. Captain Wolf's voice crackled through her earpiece, distorted by layers of digital encryption but still recognizable. Hold position, Talon 7. We have a complication. Sarah's finger paused on the trigger, though her scope remained fixed on Kozlov's center mass. Through her enhanced optics, she could see the man's lips moving as he spoke with his associates. 3 other men whose files painted pictures of cruelty that defied easy categorization. Complication? Sarah asked, her voice betraying none of the impatience that would have characterized her old self. The woman she had been would have demanded immediate clarification. The operative she had become understood that complications in Black Talon operations usually meant that the simple solution was about to become very complex indeed. Intelligence intercept 30 seconds ago. Wolf replied. Kozlov's meeting isn't just about weapons sales. He's brokering a ceasefire negotiation. The chemical weapons transaction is a cover for peace talks between two faction leaders who've been killing each other's people for 18 months. Sarah felt her world tilt, slightly off its axis. Clarification requested. The two men sitting with Kozlov. They're not buyers. They're representatives of opposing groups who've been using Kozlov as a neutral intermediary. The weapons discussion is camouflage. They're actually negotiating an end to hostilities that have killed over 3,000 civilians. Through her scope, Sarah watched Kozlov gesture toward a briefcase on the table. She had assumed it contained payment authorization or sample materials. Now, with Wolf's revelation, she realized it might contain peace accords that could save thousands of lives. Mission parameters? Sarah asked, though her finger remained poised over the trigger. This was the moment Dr. Vasquez had warned her about, when the clarity of purpose that made Black Talon operators effective would be tested against moral complexity that defied easy calculation. Unchanged, Wolf replied after a pause that lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough for Sarah to understand that heated discussion was occurring in the control room. Kozlov's death prevents the chemical weapons sale and disrupts his network. Permanently. The peace negotiations are not our primary concern. Sarah's training told her to accept the mission parameters without question. Kozlov was a verified threat whose elimination would prevent mass casualties. The peace talks were a secondary consideration, especially since there was no guarantee they would succeed or that any resulting ceasefire would hold. But something else, some vestige of the woman she had been, or perhaps some evolution of the woman she was becoming, made her hesitate. Talon 7, Wolf's voice carried a note of warning. Status report. I have an alternative approach, Sarah said, her mind racing through possibilities that existed in the spaces between official orders and creative interpretation. What if Kozlov dies, but the peace negotiations succeed? The silence that followed stretched long enough for Sarah to track the movement of a cat across a distant rooftop. When Wolf finally responded, her voice carried curiosity rather than disapproval. Explain. Kozlov is using the peace talks as cover for weapons sales, but that doesn't mean the talks themselves lack value. If he dies in a way that appears to be targeting his weapons activity specifically, the faction representatives might conclude that someone, not necessarily us, wants to prevent arms sales but supports peace efforts. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, rain streaming down her face but her hands steady as carved stone. The weapon I'm carrying can deliver a round that fragments on impact. Instead of a clean kill shot, I create a scenario where Kozlov appears, to be killed by a bomb hidden in his weapon sample case, possibly planted by a rival arms dealer or by one of his previous clients who felt betrayed. Through her earpiece, she could hear muffled conversation in the control room, multiple voices, though she couldn't make out words. After 93 seconds of discussion, Wolf returned. Dr. Vasquez wants to know how you're calculating the psychological impact on the faction representatives. Sarah had already considered this. Peace negotiators who witness what appears to be an assassination attempt by arms dealers will interpret it as validation that violent solutions lead to violent consequences. It reinforces their decision to pursue peaceful resolution while eliminating the actual threat to regional stability. And if they conclude that outside forces are manipulating the situation, they'll assume it's rival criminal organizations, not state actors. The message becomes, choose peace or become targets yourselves, rather than foreign powers are interfering with sovereign decisions. Another pause, shorter this time. General Thorne is requesting direct communication. Sarah's blood chilled. In 6 months of Black Talon operations, She had never spoken directly with the general during a mission. His voice, when it came through her earpiece, carried the weight of command decisions that had shaped conflicts across multiple continents. Talon 7, this is Control Actual. Your proposal demonstrates exactly the kind of thinking we hoped to develop in the program. However, you're suggesting significant deviation from established mission parameters in real time. Sarah's training screamed at her to acknowledge the general's authority and execute the original mission without further discussion. But her evolving tactical instincts, the same ones that had solved the impossible shot in the Crucible, whispered that rigid adherence to predetermined solutions was exactly the kind of thinking Black Talon was designed to transcend. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying across the rain-soaked rooftop to satellite relays and encrypted channels, "with respect, wasn't I recruited specifically because I see solutions that exist outside conventional parameters?" The laugh that came through her earpiece was brief but genuine. "Point taken, Talon 7. You have authorization to implement your alternative approach, but understand, if this fails, if the peace talks collapse anyway, if civilian casualties exceed acceptable parameters, the responsibility is mine, sir," Sarah interrupted, and realized as she spoke that she truly meant it. She wasn't just accepting tactical command of the mission, she was accepting moral ownership of its consequences. "Execute," General Thorne said simply. Sarah's shot, when it came, was a masterpiece of applied physics and psychological manipulation. The fragmenting round struck Kozlov's briefcase with surgical precision, creating an explosion that appeared to originate from within while leaving the peace documents intact but blood-spattered, a detail that would reinforce the narrative of weapons dealers dying by their own products while peace remained literally within reach for those wise enough to grasp it. The aftermath unfolded exactly as Sarah had predicted. The faction representatives, shaken by witnessing what they believed to be the violent death of an arms dealer, signed preliminary agreements before emergency services finished evacuating the cafe. Within 72 hours, weapons shipments to both groups had ceased. Within a week, civilian casualties in the region dropped by 90%. "Textbook execution," Wolf said during Sarah's debriefing 3 days later. "Clean elimination, strategic objectives achieved, and bonus prevention of approximately 4,000 projected casualties from continued ethnic violence." Sarah nodded, accepting the praise with the same emotional detachment she now applied to most aspects of her existence. The woman who had once sought approval and recognition from superiors felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. The operative she had become understood that true success in Black Talon operations was measured not in commendations or career advancement, but in problems that stopped existing and threats that never materialized. "Dr. Vasquez wants to discuss something with you," Wolf continued, her tone shifting subtly. "She's concerned about the rate of your psychological adaptation." Sarah understood the concern. Her transformation had proceeded faster and more completely than anyone had anticipated. The safeguards that were supposed to preserve essential humanity were holding, but barely. She could still feel compassion, could still recognize the value of human life, but these emotions now felt more like intellectual concepts than visceral truths. "Am I becoming dangerous?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the answer. "You're becoming effective," Wolf replied carefully. "Whether that's the same thing depends on how well you maintain conscious control over your enhanced capabilities." That evening, alone in her quarters that officially didn't exist in any building that wasn't on any map, Sarah performed the ritual that Dr. Vasquez had taught her. She looked at photographs from her childhood in Montana, images of family gatherings, high school graduation, college friends, and forced herself to remember what it felt like to be someone who worried about normal things like test scores and social acceptance and whether the boy she liked would ask her to prom. The exercise was becoming more difficult each time. The emotions felt increasingly artificial, like an actor performing a role in a play about someone else's life. But she persisted, understanding that these memories were anchors that kept her, tethered to something essentially human, even as her professional life carried her further into territories that existed beyond conventional morality. She had become exactly what General Thorne had seen in her that first day, a guardian angel who worked in shadows, solving problems that kept generals awake at night. But the price of that transformation was the gradual erosion of everything that had once defined her identity. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between missions, Sarah wondered if the woman who had requested rifle assignment in Colonel Morrison's office would recognize what she had become. But those moments of reflection were brief, quickly overwhelmed by the constant stream of threats that required her unique combination of technical skill, tactical creativity, and moral flexibility. She was Talon 7 now, one of 12 individuals worldwide who existed in the spaces between official acknowledgement and necessary action. She was a problem solver who specialized in permanent solutions, a guardian whose protection came at prices her beneficiaries would never know they had paid. And tomorrow there would be another briefing, another scenario, another opportunity to prevent catastrophe through methods that would never appear in any official military manual. The work continued, as it always did, in the shadows cast by the light of civilization, shadows that required guardians willing to become something more and something less than human in service of preserving both.